On September 26, 2025, the narrative landscape of the Russo-Ukrainian War underwent a significant transformation, not dictated by tactical movements on the front lines, but by a series of high-level diplomatic and economic declarations originating from Washington, D.C. and New York. These events signaled a coordinated and intensified effort to exert maximum pressure on the Russian Federation's capacity to sustain its military operations, which have now extended into their fourth year. The day's developments focused on three core axes: reinforcing NATO's deterrence posture, escalating economic warfare against Russia's energy sector, and reaffirming robust support for Ukraine's strategic objective of territorial restoration. At 9:15 a.m., the day's strategic communications began with a clear statement from President Donald Trump regarding the protocol for responding to Russian military incursions into NATO airspace. For months, intermittent violations by Russian missiles, drones, and occasionally aircraft in the airspace of Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states have tested the alliance's reaction thresholds. When questioned on whether NATO countries should engage and shoot down such Russian assets, the response was affirmative. However, when pressed on whether the United States would provide direct military backing in such an engagement, the position was articulated with calculated ambiguity. Depends on the circumstance, but we're very strong toward NATO. This statement serves a dual purpose. Firstly, it provides member states on the eastern flank with a degree of assurance in American backing, empowering them to take a more robust defensive posture. Secondly, the "depends on the circumstance" clause preserves strategic flexibility for the United States, preventing an automatic, treaty-invoked escalation from a localized air defense incident. This nuanced stance is designed to deter further Russian provocations without locking the U.S. into a single, predetermined course of action, thereby complicating Moscow's risk calculations. Subsequently, at 11:30 a.m., a formal written statement was disseminated, providing a comprehensive assessment of the war and outlining a revised strategic outlook. The document represented a stark departure from previous, more cautious evaluations of Ukraine's offensive capabilities. The primary assertion was that Ukraine, with sustained financial and military support from the European Union and NATO, now possesses the potential to achieve a decisive military victory, defined as the full restoration of its internationally recognized 1991 borders. The statement framed Russia's 3.5-year campaign as a strategic failure, directly challenging its pre-war status as a premier military power. It employed critical language, describing the protracted conflict, initially projected by many analysts to conclude within weeks, as evidence of systemic weakness, effectively labeling the Russian military a paper tiger. This assessment was directly linked to Russia's deteriorating internal economic conditions. The statement specifically highlighted the growing fuel crisis inside Russia, referencing long gasoline lines and the diversion of the national budget toward a war economy. The strategic logic presented was that as the Russian populace begins to directly experience the severe economic consequences of the war, manifesting in shortages of essential goods, internal political pressure on the Kremlin will mount. The proclamation concluded with a call to action for Kyiv, stating, "This is the time for Ukraine to act." It coupled this encouragement with a pledge to continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want to do with them, signaling a policy of equipping allies to enable and support Ukrainian operations without direct U.S. intervention on the battlefield. This written declaration functions as a piece of strategic, psychological warfare. Its intended audience is threefold. It aims to bolster Ukrainian morale, create anxiety and doubt within the Russian establishment, and signal to European allies that the United States is adopting a more aggressive posture aimed at ending the conflict on terms favorable to Ukraine. Almost concurrently, at 12 p.m., reports emerged from Russian state-controlled media outlet TASS that provided direct corroboration of the economic pressures cited. According to TASS, Russian authorities are in advanced discussions to implement a complete ban on the export of gasoline and other fuels. For a nation whose economy is heavily reliant on hydrocarbon exports, often dubbed the gas station of the world, such a measure is an extraordinary indicator of a severe domestic supply crisis. This shortage is a direct result of Ukraine's sustained campaign of long-range drone strikes targeting Russian oil refineries and fuel depots. These asymmetric attacks have successfully degraded Russia's refining capacity, creating a critical bottleneck between its crude oil production and its ability to produce usable fuels for both its military and civilian sectors. The fact that state media is publicly reporting on these discussions suggests the problem has become too significant to conceal, and that the government is preparing the populace for drastic measures. The fuel crisis represents a tangible success for Ukraine's strategy of striking at the economic heart of Russia's war machine. The inability to supply its own domestic market, let alone export, will have cascading negative effects on Russian military logistics, industrial production, and public sentiment. Later in the day, at 2 p.m., these policy positions were formalized and presented to the international community during an address at the UN General Assembly. The speech underscored the gross miscalculation by Moscow regarding the initial invasion, contrasting the anticipated 3-day operation with the brutal reality of a protracted, high-casualty war. Casualty estimates were cited at 5,000 to 7,000 soldiers killed per week, combined from both sides, to emphasize the devastating human cost. The centerpiece of the address was a pivot to economic warfare, directly identifying the primary financial enablers of Russia's war effort. China and India were named for their continued large-scale purchases of Russian crude oil. More pointedly, the speech criticized NATO member states that have failed to fully divest from Russian energy products. This was framed as a fundamental contradiction. They're funding the war against themselves. A clear ultimatum was then issued. If Russia is not prepared to negotiate an end to the war, the United States is prepared to impose a new, very strong round of powerful tariffs intended to cripple the Russian economy and stop the bloodshed. However, a crucial condition was attached. For these tariffs to be effective, European nations must adopt identical measures in unison. The message was unambiguous. Europe must step it up and immediately cease all energy purchases from Russia. This public address elevates the economic conflict to a new level. By threatening secondary sanctions and tariffs, the US is moving to close the financial loopholes that have allowed Moscow to weather previous economic restrictions. The public calling out of specific allies is a high-risk diplomatic maneuver designed to force compliance and create a truly unified economic front against Russia. At 3:30 p.m., the U.S. ultimatum elicited a swift response from the European Union. In a statement, the EU Commissioner affirmed the validity of the American position, stating, "President Trump is absolutely right. We're on it." The Commissioner outlined the significant progress already made, including a complete cessation of Russian coal imports and massive reductions in gas and oil. Crucially, the statement acknowledged that some Russian energy, particularly liquefied natural gas, LNG, and pipeline oil, still reaches the continent. In direct alignment with the U.S. proposal, the Commissioner announced forthcoming actions to close these remaining channels. The plan includes imposing sanctions on ports that receive Russian LNG and implementing tariffs on the remaining oil supplies. The stated goal was unequivocal. We are really getting after the last bits of oil and gas coming from Russia to the European Union. We want to get rid of it. The EU's rapid and positive response indicates a high degree of pre-coordination with Washington. This signals the imminent launch of a new, more severe sanctions regime, targeting countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey, which have continued to serve as conduits for Russian energy into the European market. The day culminated at 5 p.m. in a high-profile meeting between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The meeting served to solidify the strategic alignment and project an image of unwavering support. Prior to the formal discussions, Trump condemned recent Russian attacks that threatened NATO territory, framing them as desperate acts by Moscow to expand the conflict and rally domestic support amid a failing recruitment drive. During the meeting, President Zelenskyy provided a tactical battlefield update, lending concrete military evidence to the narrative of Russian decline. He reported that in the preceding month alone, Ukrainian forces had liberated over 360 square kilometers of territory and captured approximately 1,000 Russian soldiers. These figures were presented as a direct result of Western military aid, particularly through programs enabling NATO countries to procure U.S. weaponry for Ukraine. President Zelenskyy then reinforced the diplomatic and economic messages of the day, expressing his support for the plan to stop the remaining flow of Russian energy into Europe. He noted recent good conversations with the Prime Minister of Slovakia, suggesting a potential willingness to find alternative energy sources, but acknowledged that Hungary remains a significant diplomatic challenge. Overall, September 26, 2025, marked a pivotal moment in the strategic conduct of the war. While the front line saw incremental changes, the diplomatic and economic battlefronts witnessed a coordinated and decisive escalation. The United States, in concert with the European Union, has articulated a new, holistic strategy aimed at collapsing Russia's ability to wage war. This strategy integrates psychological operations, publicly declaring Russia a paper tiger, direct economic warfare, threatening unified tariffs, and closing energy loopholes, and sustained military support for Ukrainian counteroffensives. The day's events have significantly increased the pressure on Moscow and its remaining economic partners, setting the stage for a critical new phase of the conflict, where Russia's economic resilience will be tested as never before.